Hello, everybody. My name is Hortense Gerardo, and welcome to the 29th Annual Woods Hole Film Festival, the virtual version. Thank you for being with us today for the Q&A for Medicating Normal. And the festival runs from now through midnight on August 3rd. There's been an extension, so it's not too late to get your tickets and place your votes for the amazing lineup of films that we have in store for you. Before we begin, we would like to thank all of the festival supporters and sponsors. The festival is made possible by the assistance and support of many people, and we hope that we will be able to count on you going forward as we continue to develop the virtual screening platform. A couple of housekeeping items. All films are eligible to receive both an audience and a jury award. You can vote for the audience awards for the feature films in the platform. On the home image of each film, you'll see stars next to the box that says watch later. That's where you vote. 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest score. For the short films, we will send a pass and ticket holders further information about how to vote. We are starting something called Shorts-a-Palooza starting tomorrow, so everyone will be able to vote for the shorts. During today's Q&A, which will last around 45 minutes, I will be speaking with the filmmakers for a bit, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Please write your questions in the Q&A section, which is on the space bar at the bottom. I will then pass along your questions for response. Please mute your audio. Enjoy, and thank you for being with us today. So let's begin. We have the wonderful director, one of the co-directors here, Lynn Cunningham, Dr. Anna Lemke, Angie Peacock, and producer Muffie Meyer with us today. Welcome. Welcome. Lynn, why don't we start with you? I know that you had some things that you wanted to say about the film, so please do start.
Thank you, Hortense. Thank you. And thank you, Woods Hole Film Festival, for screening Medicating Normal, and to our friends, families, and supporters who helped make this film possible, and of course, our audience for not only watching it, but taking time to be here tonight. We have a great panel. My co-producer, Muffie Meyer of Middlemarch Films, who's directed and produced more than 75 films over the past 20 years, many that have won awards. Dr. Anna Lemke, psychiatrist, professor, and addiction specialist from Stanford University. Dr. Lemke is the author of a best-selling book on the prescription drug epidemic called Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. And finally, Angie Peacock, a true American hero, veteran, survivor, social worker, whose story you know, and who is now integral to the film's outreach effort. Angie and our outreach team has presented the film at 7 festivals and more than 80 community outreach screenings. The response has convinced us more than ever that this is a story that needs to be told now. It's our hope that these conversations, like the one we're going to have today, will begin to challenge certain assumptions about mental illness and our reliance on medication. I'm gonna let the panelists introduce themselves and briefly give their impressions on the film, but I want to first tell you about why I made the film, because that's a question that we're always asked. The film began as a personal quest to help a struggling family member diagnosed with a serious mental illness, a scholar athlete who 10 years after graduating from college was taking 10 prescribed psychiatric drugs daily. Every day, and really every day, she'd call to say, "Linny, is everything going to be okay?" While all her friends from college were excelling in their careers, she could not hold down a job and was collecting disability. And when we spoke, I always reassured her that we, her family, loved her and that no matter what, she would always be okay. But eventually I realized that she was not talking about her material needs. She was talking about regaining her agency, her ability to be the high-functioning individual she had been before her 10 years of treatment. And I felt that in order to help her, I needed to know more about what she was putting into her body. And what I learned shocked me and inspired the making of this film. My filmmaking partner, Wendy, and I discovered a treasure trove of online support groups, books, published studies, unpublished studies, and began to meet with survivors, peers, leaders, experts who all helped shed light on these matters. We interviewed hundreds of former patients suffering from what they knew to be harm from psychiatric drugs. Each story, like Angie's, moved us deeply And we knew then that what had begun as a personal quest had turned into a mission to tell this story. It's not the whole story, and we acknowledge there are other perspectives. Many feel they benefit from these drugs, but this particular story was not being told, and we knew we had to find a way to tell it. As Angie said eloquently after one film screening, it's the different voices all in one room that safely move the conversation to places it's never been. So we welcome your questions, but first I'd like our panelists to briefly introduce themselves again and just speak a little bit about their reaction or involvement in the film. Muffie, do you want to go first?
Sure. So first of all, it's great to be at the Woods Hole Film Festival, even virtually. I spent a number of summers at Woods Hole when I was a kid and went to the Marine Biological Lab Science School in the summer. I came to the project really knowing nothing about the subject except having a number of friends and family members who had various issues and were on medications for long periods of time. So I was brought onto the project for my skills at structuring a documentary, and I, came onto it knowing almost nothing about the subject. In fact, actually believing the chemical imbalance theory. And I learned a huge amount about the subject, needless to say, working on it from my colleagues and from the people in the film and from a bit of reading and so on. I also have to confess I was a bit of a skeptic when I came to the project, and quickly learned just how damaging these drugs could be to some people, and especially over the long term, and especially in cocktails, multiple drugs. So that's really my involvement in the film. And probably if you have filmmaking questions, I can address those. The other kinds of questions could go to people with more expertise on the drug side of things than I have.
Dr. Lemke?
Yeah, so thank you for having me on the panel. I'm really excited to be here and also to be involved in this project. It's a great honor. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm on the faculty at the Stanford University School of Medicine, and I was trained in the decade of the brain, the 1990s, when the reductionistic approach to every mental health problem was going to be found in the form of a pill. And over the course of my career, I've become more and more skeptical of that claim and that theory. And in the last 10 to 15 years, have devoted most of my professional time to combating the problem of opioid and psychotropic overprescribing in the medical profession. I do want to say that every day in clinic, I prescribe psychiatric medications. I have patients who really benefit. I'm so grateful for the tools. But at the same time, it's really important to realize that there's a time and a place and a way to use these powerful chemicals, and that patients really can be harmed when we don't use these tools properly.
Angie.
Hi, I'm Angie. You saw my story in the film, part of it. I am now 4.5 years off of all medication after basically 15 years in the mental health care system. I graduated with my master's in social work recently after the film, and now I just work on the outreach team, volunteering, and I help organize the screenings. And basically I sold everything I own because I believe in this project so much. And I moved into an RV, and I've been traveling across the country showing the film, except the pandemic ruined it. So now we're just doing virtual screenings, but they're just as fun. It's just in the comfort of the RV or a house that I happen to be in instead of, in person, so I really I value the discussion that comes after the film the most, because it gives a chance for further discussion on what was raised. And I've met, thousands of people on the road with all different backgrounds, people that said this happened to me too, parents that are frustrated about their children not getting better, prescribers that are frustrated that they don't know how to deprescribe, or they don't know how to talk to their clients about informed consent. So it's just across the board, it's a conversation that needs to be had, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Thank you, Angie.
So thank you guys for introducing yourselves. I think we should open it up for questions.
Well, we have Rose who says, thank you to all the panelists for this Q&A panel. It's wonderful to be here and I loved watching Medicating Normal. Thank you, Rose, for joining us. And please do pose any questions that you have. I encourage any of the viewers out there to just type into the chat box and I will certainly convey this to our panelists. Well, while we wait for some questions, I actually have a couple. I was very curious about how Lynn and your co-director Wendy found the compelling subjects to feature in your documentary film.
There are countless support groups online. And I think in the very beginning, we put out an ad over about maybe 6 different support groups. And these contain thousands of people in each group. And we said, we're making a film about the impact of psychiatric drugs. What is your story? Contact us if you have something interesting. And it was the floodgates were open.
So you posted these on support groups, like websites and things?
Yes. And I would say people contacted us by email. Then we conducted maybe definitely more than 100 interviews between the two of us. Each one more interesting and then the other just there are a lot of commonalities in the story. And we knew at that point, wow, there's something going on here. And then we began the hard work of finding our experts who could corroborate what was going on about, am I off?
Just for a second, we lost you just for a moment, but you're back.
Yeah. We after finding all these stories and we met, then that group of more than 100 people we narrowed down to 20 people that we didn't meet 20 in person. It was about maybe 10 people that we actually met in person, and we were looking for people like Angie who could tell the story in a very compelling way, and also that gave some hope, because there are a lot of people who don't have hope, and that was really important to us, that this is not a story that you need hope to tell this story, I feel. So that's how we found and then our experts, we did a lot of reading, and for instance, Dr. Lemke's book was incredible and gave advice, and it was practical, and Dr. Alan Francis, his book Saving Normal was fascinating.
Lynn, I'm afraid that you're frozen.
I'll add one thing to what Lynn was saying about that. And one of the things that has caused occasionally confusion is that, that Lynn and Wendy also wanted to find people who had, it was about medicating normal, whatever normal means, but without severe, truly severe mental problems. So that was another kind of criteria.
Well, I was just going to ask you a question about your role, Muffie, in that I was curious, how was the way that you filmed this similar or different from other projects that you have been on?
Well, I wasn't there for the actual filming. I was there for the, the structuring of the film. But I will say in general that, that every film is a learning experience, and then you can't apply you could apply very little of what you learned to the next film, because each film brings with it its own issues, its own problems, its own joys, and so on. So, yes. In some ways it had many of the same elements as many documentaries, that is cinema verite stories, a kind of journalistic looking deeply into a subject, interviews with experts, that kind of thing. And then in trying to put that all together into a cinematic structure that has to have a kind of beginning, a middle, some sort of a denouement, even if it's something where the audience feels they've really learned something, or is the big challenge.
Yes.
Life doesn't have a beginning and a middle and a climax in general.
That's right. So your storyboarding role really comes after all the footage has been taken, as opposed to in feature documentary films where you draft a storyboard, you have a shot list, and you know pretty much what's going to
And you have
happen.
a script. Yeah.
Exactly. I'd like to direct a question over now to Angie, because Angie, you take us on such a journey in this documentary film, and it covers, it seems like, this really broad swath of your life. I was really wondering, at what point in your life did the documentary start, and where were you in your journey, at the time that this film started?
Oh, it was the hardest period of my whole life. I had been, I was 8 months off of the benzo, was the last drug that I tapered. So what happened was the last several years, I just slowly did a harm reduction approach. I just didn't feel good. I knew that the meds were harming me in some way. I knew I didn't feel good taking them, but I didn't really have a clear picture of like, I want to get off of all of them. So I had just been tapering each drug one at a time. So first I had tapered Effexor, and then I had tapered Cymbalta, and then there was like a 2-year gap, and then I tapered the benzo. And when I got lower and lower on the benzo, I got worse and worse and worse, and no one identified that I was in withdrawal while I was still taking it, right, which is a thing that Dr. Lemke can talk about. But so I had been they basically cut me off cold turkey in the hospital. And so what happened was a period of like nervous system shock. Like my body just went completely haywire. I barely left the couch. I didn't speak for like 2 months. I couldn't like talk. I mean, I was in the worst state of horrific hell that I never even knew existed, because I had degrees in psychology. I had been to 12-step meetings. I was training as a therapist. I had never heard that like there was a thing called benzo withdrawal. Like I had no idea.
Yeah.
So basically I was 8 months off. I was getting my help from a peer support group, and someone gave them my name and said, you should talk to Angie. She should be in the film. They called me on the phone. I said, absolutely not. Because at that period of time, I was suffering so badly. I didn't even want to be on the planet. Like I was pretty close to suicide at that point. So they flew out to talk to me, and I barely told them anything because I just was suffering so badly. I could barely like articulate what was happening to me. But they got me, I said yes. And in a weird way, I really feel like it helped me hang on, because I knew like, you can't kill yourself. Like you have to tell the story, because I felt like if I were to die by suicide, the story that would be told was like, she was just a crazy veteran. She had PTSD. It was her mental illness. And I knew that that's not what was happening to me.
Right.
So I was like, no, I have to tell the story the right way. So I'm really grateful that I'm a part of it, because in a way it kind of saved my life at that period.
And how many years ago would that have been?
So that was 4 years ago. So they followed me for 3 years. I think they took about, I think we did like 6 video shoots. So what you see in the film is literally 1/100th of the footage that we got.
Yes, this is the way it works in the industry, unfortunately. So much ends up on the cutting floor. And it's tough. We were talking before we went live just how tough it is to really hone it down to that final version. Well, you talked about a very specific weaning down schedule, how you went off of Cymbalta and you went off of Zoloft. Did you make that decision, or was this in collaboration with your healthcare worker?
At all times, I was under the care of a medical supervision, but unfortunately, I don't think the medical profession is equipped to handle someone as sensitive as I am. Like Dr. Lemke says in the film, there's a small cohort of patients that has a really horrible time trying to come off, and I was in that cohort. But 10 years ago, I was not in that cohort. I came off other drugs completely fine, nothing ever happened. But after long-term use, who knows what happened, but my body just did not handle it well. So during the Cymbalta taper, for instance, you see a different tapering thing in the film, but what I did was count the beads. So I would open the Cymbalta caplet. I knew that there was 300 beads in there, and I would lick my finger and count to 10, okay, 10, and I'd spit them out. And I did that for 2.5 years to get off Cymbalta, because that's just how hard it was.
Yeah. And how did they choose the order? Like what directed them? Was this just random?
That's the other problem. We don't know. There's no evidence of if you're on a cocktail of drugs, which one are you supposed to do first?
Yeah. So it's really a crapshoot.
Yeah.
Basically.
Really, yeah.
We've got a question here. from, well, it says it's Angie Peacock, but I know it's not Angie Peacock. What it says, for Dr. Lemke, why do you think the adverse effects / withdrawal from these psychotropic agents is so misunderstood and sometimes even denied by mainstream medicine? For example, like in the film, when Dave Cope explains that when he reported to his doctor with these complaints, he was simply told to take yet another medication instead of anyone acknowledging that these adverse effects and withdrawals are indeed possible and were most likely the cause of his issues. Are these issues not discussed in medical education, and are they found anywhere in the literature?
So the problem of addiction, dependence, prescription medication, dependence, and withdrawal are really very poorly covered across medical training, whether it's nursing or medical school, social work training. It's a little bit better now than it was when I went through, but it's really, we get very little education. I maybe got 2 hours in my entire 4 years of medical school. So that's the first problem. But the second really important piece of this is that the entire medical infrastructure is designed to prescribe pills. And there are so many reasons for that, but one of the very obvious ones is that's what doctors get paid to do. So that's not to say that every time we prescribe a medication, we make $1. It's not that obvious. It's all of these invisible incentives that are built into the way that medicine is practiced. For example, I will make a lot more money if I do a medication management visit than I will make for doing psychotherapy based on the reimbursement structure from third-party payers like Medicare, Medi-Cal, or private insurance. And again, it's not necessarily that doctors are just mercenary and don't care about their patients. I really do think that the majority of healthcare providers, there are exceptions, but the majority goes into medicine to help people, to alleviate suffering, and to save lives. But after getting into the way that medicine is structured now, we get caught up in all of these invisible incentives that drive over-prescribing. Secondary reimbursement, patient satisfaction surveys, because patients come in often expecting a pill, they want a pill. I also think a much more subtle aspect of this is just kind of cultural, the kind of quick fix. We are oriented toward sort of taking a pill or taking a chemical. That's something that patients are often wanting, but it's also something that temperamentally physicians want to do. We want to feel like, oh, we did that thing, we wrote that prescription, here you go, I can check that box. It feels very done and complete and like, I did something today. And very often in the short term, these medications do make patients feel better. So in the short term, they will come back a week later or a month later and say, that was a miracle drug, I feel so much better. And so that's got its own reinforcing quality to it. Then you've got the churn of medicine where we don't have the continuity of relationships to see that same patient 6 months or 12 months or 6 years down the road really doing very poorly on the medication. So a lot of doctors don't believe that their prescribing is problematic because they just have this little slice in time. They don't see the long-term downstream effects because it can take a long time for the adverse effects to show up, whether the adverse effect is just simple physiologic dependence or whether the adverse effect is something more severe along the lines of addiction. So that's how I would answer that question. I did want to, though, speak to something that I thought was really powerful that Angie said about how her involvement in the film and her dedication to telling another story about herself based on her involvement in the film was so crucial to her recovery. And as a psychiatrist, I deal in narratives. I've heard tens of thousands of people's stories, and I can tell you that the way that people narrate their lives is absolutely fundamental to their healing or their lack of healing. And when people come in and tell redemptive, recovery-oriented healing stories, they are much more likely to get better than if they come in telling stories where they are helpless, they are victimized, and they need other people to fix them. So I just think, and the whole prescribing and labeling and saying that people are mentally ill, is in a very subtle way, it removes agency, as Lynn described, her relative. It wasn't like figuring out exactly what her mental illness, it was giving her back that sense of agency. And that's what's so important. And by the way, we don't have to, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just really want to emphasize that. And mental illness is real. I also want to emphasize that. Like the brain, like any organ, can go awry, and it happens. And again, for some people, these medications are life-saving. But we've clearly overstepped the utility in the broad spectrum of people that we are now treating within the healthcare system.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lemke. This brings me to something that was brought up prior to us going live, which was the idea of the difference between addiction and dependency. And I know that Angie said, I can speak to that. I'd like to hear about I'd like to hear from people like a little bit more about that. Who would like to? Angie's pointing to someone.
Well, I'll say one thing from a patient's perspective, because I did, this isn't in the film, but like 14 years ago, I had where I was doctor prescribed opioids, and then it became a problem. It was very short-lived, but so I knew what addiction was. Like I knew, okay. And so when they handed me a benzodiazepine prescription, I knew, okay, well, these are things to look out for. If you run out early, if you're looking for them on the street, like if you're calling friends because you ran out or something like that. So I knew those things to look out for, to signal to me like you could be having a problem. That never happened with benzos. I took them exactly as prescribed by the doctor. In fact, when I came off of them, I had like 800 pills in my house because like I just didn't take them as much as they wanted me to. So that's from a patient perspective, where I think that we're not doing ourselves a favor by saying that like things are habit forming, because that can mean different things for different people. Because my body was absolutely dependent on the benzo, which is why when I stopped, I had withdrawal, but it wasn't in the sense that I was on the corner trying to buy them or get them from friends. So there's a lot of patients that I know personally in the peer areas that they've taken these drugs for 30 years exactly as prescribed, and they're physiologically dependent and suffering the adverse effects from them. It's something different than addiction, but I'll let Dr. Lemke say the medical side of that.
Yes, thank you, Angie.
No, that was really well said. I mean, the language here is evolving. So for example, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders edition 4, prior to the most recent edition, the term dependence was used to describe addiction. The DSM-5, the latest edition, has taken that language out as a way of really formalizing the distinction between physiologic dependence and addiction. And basically, physiologic dependence just refers to the neuroadaptation, the physical adaptation that anybody will experience ingesting a chemical on a daily basis over time, but in particular, ingesting addictive substances like opioids, benzodiazepines, and stimulants. Because with those agents, when they try to reduce the dose or try to go off, they experience a very distinct withdrawal syndrome. That withdrawal syndrome can really be experienced with other medications too, but it's not necessarily life-threatening the way it can be with benzodiazepines and opioids, for example. So, what exactly is happening in the brain, we really don't know in terms of distinguishing dependence and addiction, but it is important to make the distinction because we have many generations now of patient consumers who have taken these dependent forming medications as prescribed and really, can't be lumped in the same category as patients who have gone out and gotten that drug by some other means. And I think the quintessential example of this is babies who are born to mothers who used opioids in utero and experience what's called neonatal abstinence syndrome at the time of birth. That's basically opioid withdrawal. I don't think anybody would say that that infant is addicted, right? Because addiction is a complex biopsychosocial disorder that is manifested by drug-seeking behaviors, among other criteria. But I think we could all agree that that baby is physically dependent. So that is the distinction that we're making. Again, what's happening in the brain is not clear in terms of making that distinction, but I think we can make an important sociocultural distinction based on how our healthcare system functions now in terms of dispensing these chemicals that produce physiologic dependence.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lemke. This is very related to one of the questions that has come up by Ben Brell. He says, hello all, my name is Ben Brell. Thank you so much for such a job well done. I would like to go down or maybe off antipsychotic medication. Is it true that going off such meds is more difficult than the anti-anxiety or antidepressants?
Well, I mean, typically it's not the case that getting off of antipsychotics is harder than getting off of benzodiazepines or getting off of antidepressants, but for some people it can be just as hard. So I think this really speaks to the enormous inter-individual variability and really just the general principle. If you've been taking a molecule that changes the brain, the way your brain works, and you've been doing that consistently for months to years, then when you take away that molecule, your body will have to readapt to the absence of that substance. And that's true for pretty much anything we put into our bodies, including caffeine, right? Including sugar. But I think what we're talking about here is very powerful chemicals that change the way we think and we feel. And so the impact is much more, profound than something like caffeine potentially, and also more personal. And antipsychotics, are complicated because if you have a psychotic disorder, that can be very debilitating. The medications can be helpful. On the other hand, there is a whole recovery movement in the world of people who have psychotic disorders who are saying, why is it that hearing voices is necessarily a bad thing? Like, my voices are nice to me, and I can sort of roll with that. I think we have to, be respectful of that. As long as it's not hurting you and it's not hurting other people, and it's just sort of part of your uniqueness, then maybe that's okay. But that is a huge shift for the psychiatric profession. That is not something that is generally accepted among psychiatrists and other mental health care providers. And I guess my general advice to Ben is just, if you're going to go off of a psychiatric medication that you've been taking for a long period of time, you should do it slowly. And you should ideally do it under the supervision of somebody who can help monitor your symptoms at the same time.
Thank you for that. Let's see now, I think we got other questions. Hello, Dr. Lemke, my name is Rose. Thank you for being here. I'm a psychiatric survivor. I have been on and off psychiatric medications for 16 years, and it almost cost me my life. In my own journey in coming off medications, I still continue to interact with doctors from all specialties who deny the validity of my injury. Why is this, and how do I go about presenting my history differently, in such a way that they believe me, with medical professionals who are still so skeptical?
Well, Rose, when I hear your story, I feel such a mix of emotions. I feel so much happiness for you that you found a better path and that you are a survivor, because being a survivor is a really position of strength in the world. And I feel a lot of shame and embarrassment about my profession and our inability to be open to people's individual experience, because the truth is we really don't understand a lot about how the brain works. When we prescribe these medications, we prescribe them in a symptom-directed way. We give people diagnoses, but we don't really know what's going on in each person's brain. In terms of giving you advice about how you might communicate differently so that you are actually heard by the providers that you see, I would urge you to come in not angry. I think we see a lot of anger, especially nowadays, and I'm not sure anger is the best way to communicate with people, even when we're feeling angry. This is my personal advice, because people tend to get defensive and then they withdraw and then they're not open. So I would urge you, if you're really looking for advice on how to communicate, to come in gently and to do your best to speak from your first person experience about what happened to you and how much better you're doing now, so that you can, your story can be something that they then potentially put into their data bank, and next time think about, well, yeah, there was that one person who really did a lot better when she got off.
Can I speak to that a little bit?
Of course. Of
Just
course.
that was part you didn't really see in the film, but I had, what happened was when I'd come off the benzodiazepine, the very last drug, you know, obviously my doctor is the one that ordered that, so he saw me coming off, and then I, like what Dr. Lemke said, I was very kind about it, and but I was scared, terrified, I felt horrible, and I knew that he wasn't listening to me. So I probably wasn't the best patient, but I was like, listen, you have to write this down, write it down. And I made him write everything down, everything. And I would go from like my head to my toes to tell him all my symptoms. But you know, the trick that I used was I wore my Washington University in St. Louis t-shirt, and I would walk in with all the journal articles, and I would put them on his desk, and I'd be like, look, you need to read this. And in 14 months, he never read it. But I found out after my last appointment that because of me and because he did see it, I mean, the only thing he admitted to me was, he said, for what it's worth, I'm sorry I screwed up with you. He did say that to me. And what they did was that hospital changed their policy about prescribing initial benzodiazepine prescriptions based on him watching me and me being persistent. But again, it was tempered because I knew, which is the sad part about the mental health system that some of us have figured out, that all of your anger, your eye contact, what you say can be used against you in your record. So like, it's a very slippery slope, because I remember one time he said, how are you feeling today? And I said, well, I'm really angry, but if I tell you that I'm angry, you're going to diagnose me with bipolar. Like, I just knew I was in this danger zone and that I wasn't regulated myself. So anyway, I just want to say it's part of the process to want to convince everyone. And 99% of people are not going to be convinced. You can plant a seed. But now all I do is say, like, if I see a new provider, I'll say, have you ever heard of someone being harmed by prescribed medication over the long term? And then I sit back and I wait to see their answer. And if their answer is defensive, I let it go. I'm not going to sit there and argue with them. I just say, okay, thank you very much. And I just know I need to move on. So it's a phase to want to convince them, but it's also, you know, be careful. Don't give them all of your seeds. And, you know, your story is sacred, and, you know, you have to earn the right to just tell it to anyone, I guess. They have to earn the right.
Thank you, Angie. We have another question. Oh, sorry, Lynn?
I just want to add in that was that Rose that asked that?
Yeah.
Question. Anyway, the kernel, and what Dr. Lemke said, and Angie's strategy for responding was a tension in our film about, you know, we were making a film about people who were harmed, but we wanted everybody to watch the film, because who knows who is going to see it. And we knew that if we pushed too hard and denied that there were some people who felt they were helped by the drugs, if we did not acknowledge that, they would not listen. So I think that dynamic is the same maybe in the doctor's office, the way Dr. Lemke describes defensiveness. If you are not on the attack and you are, as Angie says, you ask questions, you present things to read. Ivan, the pharmacist, said he asks his clients to write down observations about how they feel in a journal, which I think, so if you come in armed with self-observation of course it's hard not to be angry, but in a way that doesn't make the person you're speaking to feel attacked or denied, maybe that's a better way. And we felt it in the making of the film itself, this tension.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that, Lynn. All right, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. And it says, I have been taking Klonopin for 10 years as needed. Only in the last 2.5 years have I been taking it regularly, 0.5 milligrams 3 times a week. Over the last 5 months, I have cut dosage down to 0.25 milligrams twice a week. Can I safely decrease it by 10% a week? Will there be adverse consequence? I really feel the withdrawal now.
Well, I'm happy to try to answer that. So everybody's different, and there's no one right way to taper. And it is true that as the dose gets smaller, especially of benzodiazepines, it can get harder, and you feel more of the withdrawal. It's interesting that you're just taking it intermittently through the week, just twice a week, so you're not a daily user. People who use daily struggle much more because they have more neuroadaptation, more dependence, and more withdrawal. It sounds like so far you've had success. So as long as you can tolerate the withdrawal symptoms, I would say continue as you are. The decreasing by like 10% per week, which has sort of been the recommendations for decades, is probably too fast for a lot of people. We have patients who decrease by 5% every couple of months or even slower. The key when you're tapering is to go slowly and just never go backwards. So once you decrease that dose, what you don't want to do is go back up again, because every time you decrease, your body will readjust to that new lower dose. And really, if you give it enough time, you'll feel fine, after a certain period of time, usually about a month. But then you don't want to go back up again. So I would say continue as you've been doing, trying to just decrease as tolerated. But whatever you do, whenever you commit to going down, stay at that lower dose, and then just keep it there until you feel like you've adapted. And once you've adapted, then you can consider going down again.
Thank you, Dr. Lemke.
I could also just mention, if you've never heard of Heather Ashton, she's a really wonderful physician who's written something called the Ashton Manual, ASHTON, which is available for free online, which is a whole compendium about benzodiazepines and also how to taper and also sample tapers. And Heather Ashton died earlier this year or last year, but she is, her obituary was written up actually in the New York Times for her contribution to the understanding of benzodiazepine, prescription benzodiazepine dependence and withdrawal.
And also we have some resources on our website on medicatingnormal.com. One is the Withdrawal Project that, it's really like the layperson community put all their wisdom together since the medical field kind of abandoned us a little bit. So there's some helpful articles there to read about basically exactly what Dr. Lemke just said about listening to your body, about going as slow as you need to be, anyway. And there's Benzo Buddies, that's just another forum online. There's lots of stuff on our website.
Thank you for that, Angie. We are at time. I wanted to just say that there was a moment in the film that I found just so heartbreaking, and it was something you said, Angie, in which you were looking back, and it was at the camp, and you had said that, when you were in the military and you had lost one of the people in your regimen, and how things might have changed if someone had just said, you're just, sad. And how, society has changed in their approach to, emotion, uncomfortable emotion. And I just found that very moving. I know that from my previous experience, my education, I had been told that no one gets diagnosed as a schizophrenic on the first visit, that there is such a thing as a schizophreniform syndrome, in which 6 months of developing symptoms are required before anyone could prescribe or diagnose an official case of schizophrenia. And that applied for other forms of mental health issues. This is way back, we're talking about in the 80s. And it seems as though that kind of period of wait and see seems to have disappeared in the medical field now. And people are just too willing to just prescribe. And looking back, Angie, do you think that might have been helpful if someone had just said, just wait and see, 6 months?
Yeah, I think obviously it made me cry just hearing you say that, because I really think, excuse me, the initial trauma of the war, pales in comparison to the trauma that I've been through, coming off the medication, So not only did I kick the can down the road for my own healing to be able to process what happened, 15 years ago, but now I have to heal from this neurological damage. And I know I look fine and I sound fine, but having doctors not believe you for 2 years, having your body go haywire, your total nervous system, just a bomb goes off, it has changed the course of my life. I was married. I had a successful Army career. I lost everything because of this diagnosis and the way that I was treated. And it's not just me. It's like this is happening across the country, that we are just so quick to, I mean, and it's partly our fault too, that I was looking for help, but I trusted those people to give me help. But now what I've learned through that is that, like, I don't care what symptoms I have. It's part of being human, and I have to cope with it, and I have to handle it. And now there's no medication to take. There's no doctor to run to. I have to feel those feelings, the panic. I mean, I have horrible stuff a lot, but I just wish that we weren't so quick to give our bodies up, and that we were so afraid of our own emotions and our own feelings and our own grief. But in a way that's what our society does. We don't give people time to relax when you come back from Iraq. I could have taken a month off to just decompress. You know, Dave says if he took some time off from school, he would have been better. We just don't allow that. And I just think we've done a lot of harm to a lot of people, including me, you know, that we still are fighting to get back.
Well, I want to assure you, Angie, that you are a warrior of just another level. I was so inspired by you in this film and what all of you are doing by getting this message out there. It's very important what you're doing. And it is a battle that we are all engaged in, and it will take societal change in order for this to be really history. But thank you for taking this on. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for making this film and for dispensing your advice and creating a truly moving and highly relevant film. I think we're at time. I recommend all our viewers to please vote, watch the films. There's still 3 more days of screening left, and you can watch this again. I certainly will. Thank you so much for your time. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.